Soviets started attacking, there wasn't time for a debate, a dialogue, a discussion for parliaments to decide whether to mobilize. NATO had to be on a constant war footing, ready to respond. And this meant that NATO had to agree that an attack against one is an attack against all. Therefore, there will be a large standing NATO military force. The United States was an important part of it, with close to 300,000 personnel permanently stationed in West Germany. I lived in West Germany in the 1970s. My dad was part of that contingent. I know that much of his speak. But now we have a situation where, NATO has to build it. So Soros wrote about this. He talked about the need to expand NATO, but he said something interesting. In a future conflict with Russia, he said, we can't have a situation where NATO body bags come home. He said, because NATO won't accept body bags in this number. We have to, we being the collective West, have to find a source of East European manpower that we then append NATO technology to and use them as a proxy to engage the Russians militarily to bring pain to Russia. And the body bags that come home will be Eastern European, not NATO. And now we fast forward 30 years and we see that that's exactly what's happened. Ukraine is nothing more than a source of Eastern European manpower. To everybody out there who bought into the discussion of Ukrainian membership, understand this. NATO was never going to let Ukraine into its ranks, ever. Ukraine doesn't qualify, first of all. It is one of the most corrupt regimes in the world. It has endemic problems that are systemic and are unsolvable, to be frank. There are 7 criteria that have been laid out there, only 2 of which Ukraine has ostensibly met. And even then, there's a lot of waivers involved in meeting that. The other 5, Ukraine will never meet. And that's just a statement of fact. Yeah. And then the other thing is Ukraine's a nation at war. I mean, remember, this is a war that we provoked, that we created. And under Article 5, if you allow Ukraine in while it's an active conflict, NATO assumes responsibility for that conflict and must engage in direct confrontation with that. And that would mean a war with Russia. That's nuclear. The world ends. Ukraine was never going to be in. And the thing about this summit is that once and for all, it's been made clear. It should be clear to everybody, including Ukraine. You will never be part of NATO, ever in your life. Not only that, the George Soros scenario has now become clear. It's clear to the Ukrainians that this war will go on to the last Ukrainian, that the United States will never intervene on their behalf. NATO will never intervene on their behalf. Our job, our mission is to provide NATO technology to a source of Eastern European manpower to bring pain to Russia. That's been the strategy all along. And this summit proves that. The other thing is we have NATO struggling to define who it is. Remember, in the aftermath, while they were building up for the Russian conflict, there were people saying, we don't want to spend this money. They forgot how to fight. Back in the 1970s and 80s, NATO was a forward-leaning operation. We had core-level engagement, army-level engagement on the European soil. That means that we had enough people there to initiate, sustain, and prevail in a combat situation. We could take casualties and remain viable. We had artillery, we had fuel, we had other ammunition, we had logistical sustainability, all there in Europe. None of that exists today. None. We can't do this. We have heavy brigades that go over there that have enough artillery ammunition to last less than a week. Understand this. I'll give you a couple examples. During the Gulf War against Iraq, the United States military fired 60,000 artillery shells during the entire conflict. Mm-hmm. Russia fires 60,000 artillery shells in one day. Ukraine, on average, fires 7,000 artillery shells. My dogs are objecting to somebody fires 7,000 artillery shells in a day. It means in 10 days, Ukraine expends more ammunition than we expended in the entire Gulf War. We produce 75,000 rounds of ammunition a year. Under the new defense procurement budgets that are out there, we're going to ramp it up to 85,000. But again, 1 year's production won't supply Ukraine for 1 month of war. And General Cavoli, who's the commander of U.S. forces in Europe, the Supreme Allied Commander, 4-star general, U.S. Army, spoke at a Swedish Defense Forum in January, where he said that NATO couldn't imagine the scope and scale of the violence taking place in Ukraine today.
Okay.
Now think about what that says. If you can't imagine it, you're not ready to fight it, because you've been in the military. What do? When we build a contingency, it's a contingency to a problem we have imagined. We have imagined an enemy of a certain size, certain capabilities. We have devised a plan, a concept of operations to prevail against that enemy in armed conflict. So we have built a structure, the number of troops we need, amount of ammunition we need. We've planned for the duration of conflict. We've set aside the resources necessary for that duration, plus a little bit, because you always hedge on the side. And those are our plans. And what Cavoli is looking at is saying that if we took our existing contingency plan and applied it in Ukraine, we would be defeated. It's a preordained outcome. We would lose this war because we haven't imagined it. We're not prepared for it. We don't have the ammunition sustainability. We don't have the force structure. We don't have the resilience. The Ukrainians are losing 800, 900, 1,000, 1,200 men a day. How big is a heavy armored brigade? 5,000 guys?
About, yeah.
So in a week, we lose everybody. They're done, gone, and we have nothing to replace them. There's not like we're stacking armored brigades behind them for sustainability. That system's done. So NATO is a paper tiger, and that's the reality. We spent 20 years learning how to fight. Don't get too offended here, but Afghan wedding parties and Iraqi villagers, because that's pretty much what we were doing. And we forgot how to do large-scale ground combat. We forgot what combined arms operations are. We forgot how to do a division-sized passage of line. You know what I'm talking about. You got a division online fighting. They've stalled, or for whatever reason, their momentum is gone. The next division has to come through, pass through the lines to continue the operation. A very delicate operation, which, if not done properly, causes both parties to bog down and become targets. You have to train for this. Practices all the time. I was in a field artillery unit. I trained nonstop in 29 Palms, California for 2.5 years to master the art of combined arms warfare. That's constant live fire training. That's very expensive training. We don't do that anymore. We don't train at the brigade level anymore. We don't train live fire like we used to do. My battalion fired more ammunition in 1 year than the entire Marine Corps fires today in a year.
Wow.
That's just the way it is. Budgets are different. So that's our military. We haven't imagined this conflict, so we can't fight it. And yet now we have, in this summit, what do we see? We see Jan Stoltenberg talking about creating a 300,000 strong rapid response force. Now, people need to understand that there's currently a 40,000 strong rapid response force. There's nothing rapid about it, and there's nothing responsive about it. We can't get 40,000 people together. I challenge you to do that right now. Mobilize. That would have been what if I were attending the summit, I would have turned to Stoltenberg and I said, "Hey, boss, what does rapid mean? What's your advance notice you need? We need 48 hours notice. America's going to withdraw from NATO in less than 48 hours. You have 40,000 people deployed right here, right now. Go. Running clock. Can't do it because they don't exist.
They can't. Yeah, logistically they can't. There is no way. Because this is, Scott, will be almost in the equivalency of QRF, which is even, but 40,000 QRF,
they don't have it
with the small numbers, but 40,000, there is no way they can do it.
So now they want to have 300,000. So it's a joke. The NATO summit is a joke. It's basically an organization that's desperate. Remember, for 20 years, NATO was committed to Afghanistan as part of the nation-building exercise that we had ongoing there. And the United States, up until 2021, was going around telling NATO, you have to commit more. We need more from you, more. Don't worry, we're here. We're America. We're behind you. We're backing you up. But we need you to commit. And so NATO dug deep, got the money, put the troops in there, reconfigured their militaries. And then in August of 2020, we leave. Just like that. And NATO's going, wait a minute. You just told us to raise a couple $1 billion. We're doing that right now, and now you're gone, and we have to leave. So NATO is licking its wounds, and everybody was saying, is NATO worth continuing? Is the United States a reliable partner? These are serious discussions that were taking place in 2021. And so this Ukraine crisis is in many ways an artificial crisis that has been provoked by the United States and NATO to give them a reason to exist, to forget about Afghanistan and now reconfigure to the Russian threat. But here's the thing. They can't do it. There is absolute ignorance about Russia. Remember, this wasn't supposed to be a sustained military conflict. Not at all. Go back to 2021. All the discussion was about sanctions. If Russia goes into Ukraine, we were told, they will be hit with massive sanctions that will sink their economy, that will collapse their country. Putin will have a domestic crisis. Putin would probably not survive this domestic crisis. That's what everybody's thinking. So the Russian military going in, and remember, a lot of people, including myself, said if Russia goes in militarily, this thing's going to be over very quick. General Milley, chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff, 72 hours. The CIA briefed Congress, 1 week. Nobody anticipated a special military operation. Nobody anticipated the soft touch. But what everybody anticipated is that Russia would come in, the sanctions would hit, and Russia would have to retreat, not because NATO or Ukraine defeated them, but because the Russian economy and domestic pressure would compel Russia to withdraw. That was the hope. It failed. Today, the Russian economy is stronger than it's ever been in its entire existence. It is thriving. They have beat the sanctions. They have crushed the sanctions, which now means that the solution is military, and NATO isn't ready for this. Back in April or March of 2022, there was a chance for a negotiated settlement. I mean, that was the whole reason for the Russian military action. People forget this. They think that it was to take Kiev and all this stuff. It was to put pressure on the Ukrainians to compel them to go to the negotiating table, and it succeeded. Ukraine attended 3 sessions in Gomel, Belarus, attended 2 sessions in Turkey, and were prepared for a final session in Istanbul on 1 April, where they would sign a treaty which they had already approved and signed off on. They were going to sit down. The war would come to an end. And this would have been fairly favorable terms for Ukraine. Yes, they would have lost Crimea, but they had lost that already. Yes, Lugansk and Donetsk would become independent. But Kherson, Zaporizhia, Sumy, Chernihiv, Kiev, all those territories that Russia had taken would be returned. And proof that the Russians were serious about this, they went ahead and voluntarily withdrew from Kiev, from Sumy. But here's the thing. When they withdrew voluntarily, the West spun it as a Russian defeat. They said, see, the Ukrainians had pushed them back. Ukrainians didn't push them back.
It wasn't, yeah.
Russia voluntarily withdrew and said, this is a good faith measure to prove to you that when you sign this treaty, we're gone. We're out of here. We're not staying. But instead, the West looked at it and said, Russia's weak. We can beat Russia. So rather than sign that peace treaty, which would have preserved your nation, saved hundreds of thousands of lives, we want you to continue this war, and we're going to give you tens of billions of dollars of equipment. That was the gambit. It failed. It failed again when they gave them this new equipment that led to the creation of this new army that's dying right now in a failed counteroffensive. There is no military solution, and this summit proved this. The summit proved that Ukraine can't beat Russia and that NATO and the United States lack the resources that can sustain this fight. This war is lost. This war is finished, and NATO and the United States know this, but they can't admit it. So one of the big problems coming out of this summit is, how do you find a soft landing? How do you avoid the crash? Because everybody, they didn't let Ukraine in. Ukraine has been put on notice. They will never be able to join NATO. Ukraine's been giving nothing more than more promises of more equipment, but we see what happened to the last equipment. It all got destroyed. Ukraine has to sacrifice more manpower. They used to sacrifice this manpower under the belief that something would come out of this summit, that Ukraine would be given a roadmap. Ukraine would be given a timeline for the guarantee of Ukrainian membership of NATO. Instead, what they got is, you ain't never going to join.
So will I be wrong, Scott, if I say, with the statement from, for example, French President Emmanuel Macron suggested during the meeting, right after its conclusion, that we're going to be sending long-range missiles to Ukraine or supporting that. Will I be wrong if I am to say, as an analyst thinking outside the box, well, maybe Russia would just move forward and take over the Donbas and be done with it?
Well, Russia's goal. Russia's goal. That's the stated objective. Vladimir Putin has actually given a speech to that effect. He said that our goal right now is we are going to assert sovereignty over every inch of Russian territory. And right now, the Russians view Lugansk, Donetsk, the Donbass, Zaporizhia, and Kherson to be Russia. And so there's portions of Kherson, portions of Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Lugansk that are currently occupied by Ukrainian forces. And so the goal of the Russians right now are to evict them. But Russia's not going to do this in a way that causes them to sacrifice thousands of lives needlessly. Right now, look, you were in the military.
Yeah.
If two peer level forces come together in a meeting engagement, generally the side that wins is the side, if they're roughly equivalent size, is the side that can attain about a 1.2 to 1 kill ratio, meaning that you're killing slightly more than they're killing of you. And then you're able to exploit that through professional training, et cetera, through maneuver to gain an advantageous position, either through fire or maneuver or both, that compels the enemy to withdraw before being totally destroyed. Because, at some point in time, when you get certain advantages, then the problems manifest themselves in increasing fashion, and you get overwhelmed, and it's a collapse. So most professional militaries are able to sense, hey, I've been outflanked here, I'm getting suppressed here, it's time to withdraw. So it's about a 1.2 to 1 advantage. And so if you're seeking the physical destruction of a military that has 500,000 people, that means that you have to be willing to lose, because you're going to be the attacker. You're going to have to lose 500,000 plus people. Russia's not in the business of losing 500,000 people anymore. So what Russia has done is created a situation where they have fallen back on their doctrinal strength, the defense. They have dug in, they've created this impenetrable line, and what they're doing is inviting the Ukrainians to commit suicide on their defenses. Right now, the kill ratios are 8 to 1 to 10 to 1. That's unimaginable. That's crazy. That means for every Russian that dies, 10 or 8 Ukrainians are dying. Now, we got to put this in perspective. Right now, it's estimated that 24,000 Ukrainians have died since this counteroffensive began back on June 8th. 24,000. That means that Russia, if it's a 10 to 1, has lost 2,400 guys. Could America imagine 2,400 body bags coming home?
Coming here.
No, we can't. Not at all. Russia, so let's not pretend that this is an easy war for Russia. They're losing a lot of guys. This is a very costly fight for them. But now go over to the Ukrainians. These are World War I level casualty rates. These are numbers that haven't been seen since the Second World War. And even then, many battles never got this many casualties in this short a period of time because of what I said. Units tend to withdraw when they're confronted with an enemy who has achieved maneuver superiority or fire superiority. You withdraw, you preserve your force, fight another day. Here, the Ukrainians are dashing their strength on a prepared defensive line. They're just getting slaughtered, and they're just doubling down on stupid by repeating this process. This is a tragic outcome, but eventually they're going to run out of troops. And when that happens, and we're already seeing this right now because they are running out of troops, they're having to divert resources from the northern area near Limon, divert them down to sustain an offensive in the Zaporizhia area and in the Bakhmut area. And as a result, the Russians, who are feeling every day, feeling the pressure, notice there's less resistance and they're moving forward. So the Russians are actually advancing in a number of locations as the Ukrainians strip troops away to bring them to another front. And you also have to keep in mind that Russia is sitting on reserves, uncommitted reserves of 180 to 220,000. These are already formed into offensive-oriented units. They have the equipment, they have the training, they have the sustainability, and they're just waiting for the time to come. And that time will come when the Ukrainian army approaches collapse. You're a military professional, you understand what I'm talking about. There comes a point in time where unit integrity fails. Usually when you've suffered, in some units, up to 20% casualties can lead to failure. Elite units, you can probably get that, 30%, 40% casualties, and even elite units start to collapse. Command and control collapse, cohesion, morale, the whole thing. Remember, units are also designed to work together as a team. So the more casualties you suffer, the less effective your team is.
Your team is.
Some of the things that you are assuming that are going to get done aren't getting done. The guy who's supposed to protect you on the flank here ain't protecting you on the flank, which means the enemy's maneuvering around this flank. Now they've hit you here, you divert. Now you've opened this up, and that's what I talk about, the sequencing of events that lead to the destruction of a unit. The Ukrainian military is fighting on a very long front, over 1,000 kilometers, and as you start to lose resources, that means that your ability to sufficiently man that front is weakened, erodes. The Russians have reserves that haven't been committed. You don't have any more reserves as the Ukrainians. And so as you get weaker, the Russians will get stronger, and the Russians are going to end up retaking all of the Russian territory. Now, the question is, what do they do after that? And Vladimir Putin has provided a hint. He said that once we secure Russia, we are going to push Ukrainian forces back the distance that equals the maximum range of the weapon systems provided to it by NATO, which right now I think we're talking about the HIMARS system, about 150 kilometers, which means that from the territory of New Russia, the Ukrainian forces are going to be pushed back at least 150 kilometers. Now, simple map exercise, you've done this before. Yep. You take a map, you get the scale, you take your compass, you put the 20 in on 0, you put your pencil on the range that you want, and then you draw your range arcs along the border. Go do that on the border of New Russia and Ukraine, and you'll see that the range arc, the 150 kilometer range arc, means that Odessa is now occupied by Russia. Kharkov is occupied by Russia. Dnipropetrovsk is occupied by Russia. These are cities with strong majority ethnic Russian populations, and in the case of Kharkov, in case of all three, strong Russian history. And I have a feeling that once Russia occupies these cities, they're never going to give them back, which means that Ukraine has now shrunk even further. So this is the reality of the NATO summit. There's nothing that came out of the summit that's going to stop Russia from accomplishing what it wants to accomplish. So the key question is, how does NATO prevent this? They can't prevent it militarily, which means at some point in time, they're going to have to go to Zelensky and change the scripts. Right now, he's a script reader who reads the script about standing strong and hard. He's going to now have to get a new grip about negotiating a just peace. It's a poison chalice we have to drink from, he'll say, but we have no choice to preserve the nation, to stop the sacrifice. I must make this peace. And I think that's what right now they're working on. It's like Hollywood people taking a look at a script and the producer saying, we can't fund that script. We have to change it. And so they have all their screenwriters right now writing the best ending possible. And then they'll hand it to the actor, and the actor will play his part.
Well, the way I feel about because I believe that most in the West, they really do not grasp the concept of that Ukraine is a red line for Russia. That's a red line. And if they think it is that, I'm talking from a Western mindset, as people will be thinking, if they think that Russia is bluffing, they are mistaken. Russia does not bluff based on my understanding of its history. I mean, I wrote a book about Russia. I did the research and so forth, and I realized if you look at their history, they're not gonna, they won't bluff. And if NATO is pushing this far out to cross that red line, Russia's gonna react.
Well, this is one of the most dangerous things. I'm glad you brought this up. Joe Biden, in the aftermath of the summit, has because Russia has been saying all along that if you push red lines, certain red lines, we will have to respond with the totality of our capabilities, which implies the potential of nuclear weapons. And that scared a lot of people in NATO. They're like, man, this is getting very close to a nuclear thing. So what Biden recognizes right now, that if things remain the same, you're going to get the same outcome. I mean, so if what NATO has said is that we will continue to provide military resources to Ukraine. France is going to provide the Scalp missile, which is just basically the French version of the Storm Shadow that the British have already provided. The Germans and everybody are going to provide more artillery systems. The United States might provide the Abrams tank, which is just basically a slightly upgraded version of the Leopard tank, which is burning on the ground in Ukraine today. So nothing that NATO is talking about, even F-16 fighters, I think professionals realize it's a non-starter. It's not going to have any impact. There's nothing that NATO can give to Ukraine that changes the outcome. And so there might have to be other things considered. I don't know what they are, and I am loath to speculate. But Biden said Russia will never use nuclear weapons. It's a bluff, that Putin's bluffing. And what that means is that he is liberating people to start looking at policy options that aggressively confront Russian red lines. But as you just rightly noted, Putin don't bluff. Russia doesn't bluff.
No.
And we could be in a situation where we cross a red line after the Russians are screaming at the top of their lungs, stop, don't go there, don't do this, stop. And we do it anyways. And then everybody will be scratching their head when pop, the nuclear weapon goes off.
Exactly.
And that's the trajectory that we're headed on right now. And it's one of ignorance. I mean, how dare the American president say that? I mean, it's just irresponsible. It's grossly irresponsible for him to articulate it that. Now, it doesn't mean that you surrender to Russia, but what it means is you have to start injecting responsible statements from the leaders of the United States, and the United States is a leader of NATO. It's sending the wrong signal. It's saying to NATO, come up with out-of-the-box solutions that challenge the Russian red lines, because Russia's bluffing. They'll never use nuclear weapons.
And that's exactly what I got from the statement yesterday by the foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov. I read his statement. It was translated, of course. I don't speak Russian, but I read the statement by which, and I'm paraphrasing here or summarizing, basically what he's saying is that we Russians, consider the transfer of long-range missiles from France as a threat to our security. And the reason he mentioned that term security, because you and I know what's in Russia's doctrine for using the nuclear. Anytime they feel threatened, they will have the right to deploy the nuclear, because there is a threat to their sovereignty, to their security. And that's how I interpreted Lavrov's statement, by giving the warning to NATO that should you do this, you are getting closer to crossing that red line.
He also said the same thing about F-16s. He said the provision of F-16s to Ukraine would be considered in the context of a nuclear threat against Russia. And the reason is that the F-16 is one of the preferred systems used by NATO to deliver the B-61 nuclear bomb, which is the centerpiece of the nuclear sharing arrangement between the United States and NATO. Right now, there are 4 depositories of B-61 bombs in Europe. I think they're in Turkey. I think they're in Germany. I think they're in the Netherlands. And I think they're in Belgium. 5 nations are configured to deliver these weapons. That's those 4 plus Italy. But last April, NATO had a meeting in the context of the Russian invasion, or the Russian incursion into Ukraine, where the director of the nuclear directorate, Jessica Cox, said that NATO is now getting ready to share the burden of this nuclear sharing. It doesn't mean that they're going to put nuclear weapons in other locations. They're stuck with the locations they have. But what she's saying is that nations who possess aircraft of a similar characteristic to the aircraft of the 5 designated nations for nuclear delivery, that they will be configured to also deliver nuclear weapons, so that in time of conflict, there will be greater opportunity. This means that one of the principal weapon systems is the F-35A. That's the new fighter that everybody's getting. The Poles are getting 32 of them. And now the Poles will be able to have Polish F-35s on German soil, standing nuclear alert, able to be equipped with B-61 bombs. Now, from a Russian perspective, you're an analyst. So once the Poles start playing that game, every F-35A becomes a potential nuclear delivery system, which means every time a Polish F-35A takes off, Russia views it as a potential nuclear threat and has to adjust its defenses accordingly. The same thing with the Finns. They're buying another 35. They're right on the border with Russia. Every time a Finnish F-35 takes off, Russia has to assume that there's a nuclear strike potential attached to that and adjust its defense posture accordingly. Turkey was supposed to get F-35s, but they didn't. Instead, Turkey got F-16s. That's part of the deal that Turkey cut to get Sweden to be a member. F-16s. And now, so Russia's looking at saying, F-16s, you want to give F-16s to Ukraine. If you do that, every time an F-16 takes off from Ukraine, we are going to assume that it has nuclear potential, and we're going to react accordingly. Don't do it. And again, Joe Biden saying, they're bluffing. Russia will never use nuclear weapons. Never say never. Because the biggest danger right now, you talked about the Russian nuclear posture. You said if a threat manifests itself that represents an existential threat to Russia, that Russia will use nuclear weapons in response. But there's, the United States doesn't have that policy. We have a preemptive policy where we can use nuclear weapons preemptively in any situation we deem necessary. To show you how dangerous this is, during the Trump administration, they had a assistant secretary of defense who, when talking about this preemption, said the goal of the U.S. nuclear posture is that every morning Russia and China wake up, we want them to be uncertain about whether or not the United States is going to nuke them. We want them to be thinking about it. Could America nuke us today? That's a statement from an American official dealing about the American nuclear posture. And Joe Biden didn't change that posture. It's the same posture we have today. So every morning, we want Russia and China to wake up saying, is America going to nuke us today? We're worried about that. The Russians are tired of this game. So right now in Russia, and I've spoken with these people, these are people who advise the Ministry of Defense and the National Security Council on issues pertaining to nuclear posture. There's growing momentum for Russia to adopt a policy of preemption. But here's the danger. You see, one of the people who's given voice to this is a guy named Sergei Karaganov. He wrote an article recently in which he said that if Russia doesn't win this conflict soon, if this becomes a frozen conflict, which many people are saying that's the next best thing rather than having a Ukrainian defeat, just stringing out a frozen conflict. He said that ultimately that will play to the disadvantage of Russia, which means over time, Russia will get weaker and Ukraine and NATO will get stronger until there comes a point where